My name is Brooke Sheridan. I am 33 years old. I have been married to Miles Dalton for 8 years, and I have run operations behind Cedar Table. On Monday morning, I walked into my office and found Erica Vaughn sitting in my chair with Miles and his mother, Linda. Beside her, a binder rested on my desk, labeled Transition Plan. Linda told me the family had decided Erica would manage the new location and take over operations. I had 2 weeks to hand over vendor schedules, payroll procedures, event calendars, and systems I had spent years building. Miles kept his eyes down while Erica said she did not want this to become uncomfortable. I looked at my husband and asked the question that mattered. 2 weeks ago, you said we were trying to save our marriage. So when did this plan begin? Miles looked at me and said this was not personal. It was simply what the business needed. Linda added that I had helped Cedar Table, but they needed someone better suited for the next stage. I asked whether they had confirmed the transition with the accountant, the lender, and everyone connected to our operating obligations. Linda answered that Miles had handled everything. That was when I understood they were assuming everything I had built could be transferred because Miles said it could. I picked up the binder and flipped through pages, listing my responsibilities as if they were chores anyone could inherit. There were passwords, vendor contacts, staffing procedures, and deadlines, but nothing explaining why those systems worked. I closed it and said I would begin the handover. Miles exhaled so softly he probably thought I missed it. I did not. As I walked out, Erica called my name and said she hoped we could make the next 2 weeks professional. I told her I planned to be professional, then kept walking. Behind me, Linda began discussing the opening schedule, and Miles sounded lighter than he had in weeks. They thought I had surrendered. They did not understand that I had just started paying attention. For most of my marriage, Miles treated my work at Cedar Table like something useful but secondary. When I joined, the food was good and Linda had loyal customers, but everything behind the dining room was uneven. Schedules changed. Vendors were paid late. Food waste was high, and event bookings lived in separate notebooks. I spent years fixing those things until the restaurant ran like one business. I built the staffing system, renegotiated supplier terms, standardized event deposits, tracked food costs, and created monthly reports Linda could use. I became the person our lender called when numbers did not match or paperwork arrived incomplete. Miles liked to tell people I kept everyone organized. When I corrected him once and said I ran operations, he smiled and called that a fancy way to describe paperwork. At first, I laughed with him. After a while, I stopped correcting him because I thought the work spoke for itself. I never needed my name on the menu or cared who got photographed when the restaurant won an award. What mattered was knowing payroll would clear, vendors would show up, and the staff knew where they stood. Somehow, Miles took my silence as proof none of it mattered. That afternoon, I called Dana Whitlock, the CPA for Cedar Table. I asked one question. If I leave as director of operations in 2 weeks, what changes for the restaurant and the expansion plan? Dana did not guess. She said she would review the documents. Her answer arrived that evening. Miles had submitted projections to the lender showing me as a key operator for at least 18 more months. On paper, my experience was part of the reason the second location looked stable. Home. He was telling me Erica could replace me in 2 weeks. I read that line twice. If you have ever been told your work was small while someone depended on it, you know why? That hit me. Subscribe if you want to stay with this story, because that contradiction was the first I found. I did not confront Miles. I started writing down every version of the future he was telling someone else. By the end of that week, Miles was acting like the hardest part was behind him. He stopped lowering his voice when Erica called, and he talked about the second location as if the doors were open. Linda invited me to a private dinner at Cedar Table because she wanted everyone to behave like adults. I went because I wanted to hear what they said when they thought I had accepted my place outside the plan. The dining room was closed, but several managers were there with wine and small plates. Linda raised her glass and talked about the next chapter for Cedar Table. Then she introduced Erica as the person who would lead operations at the new location. I was sitting 3 seats away when everyone turned toward her and smiled. One manager asked whether I would be moving there too. Before I could answer, Miles said Brooke is stepping back to focus on her personal life. The words landed harder than I expected because he said them so easily. He had turned a decision he made without me into a story about something I had chosen. I looked at him, but I let the moment pass. After dinner, I followed him into the parking lot. I asked how many people he had told I was leaving before he bothered to tell me. Miles sighed and said I was making the situation bigger than necessary. He told me Erica had the energy the business needed, while I had become too emotionally involved. I stared at him, then got into my car. When I reached home, Dana had sent another email. She had reviewed expenses tied to the second location and found charges that moved through Cedar Table before the expansion was approved. There were hotel bills, travel costs, and consulting payments connected to Erica. None of that matched the transition Miles had described. Then I saw the total Dana had flagged. $26,000 had left the operating reserve through several transactions that had not gone through the approval process I handled. I read the dates and felt the room go quiet around me. Miles was not only replacing me, he had been building the next version of Cedar Table while keeping me responsible for system paying for it. The dates were what made everything harder to ignore. One hotel charge matched a weekend when Miles told me he was meeting a vendor about kitchen equipment. Another fell on the weekend I stayed with Linda after a minor medical procedure because Miles said work had become too busy. I had spent those 2 days bringing his mother groceries and making sure she had what she needed. He had been traveling with Erica. I waited until Miles came home that night and placed the expense list on the kitchen counter. I asked him directly whether he was having an affair with Erica. He looked at the dates, then told me I was misunderstanding a working relationship. I asked again, and this time I did not give him another explanation to hide behind. After a long silence, he admitted their relationship had crossed the line several months earlier. Miles immediately said our marriage had been distant long before Erica became involved. I asked him why, if our marriage was already over. He had let me work every day preparing an expansion he planned to build with her. His face tightened, and he said I turned everything into spreadsheets, procedures, and rules. I told him those rules were apparently important enough to keep using after he decided I was replaceable. He walked away without answering. Linda called me less than an hour later. Miles had already spoken to her, and she told me not to damage the expansion because of problems in my marriage. I asked one question before she could continue. Did you know Miles and Erica were having an affair when you put her in my office and told me to train her? Linda went completely silent. When she finally answered, she said no. I believed her, because the anger in her voice had changed direction. I told her I was not going to destroy Cedar Table, but I would not keep my name attached to responsibilities that were no longer mine. I would not guarantee information, confirm staffing plans, or support financial statements that stopped being accurate once they removed me from operations. Linda did not argue this time. The next morning, Dana called before I reached the restaurant. The lender had reviewed the updated information and wanted a meeting about the expansion package. The management assumptions in the financing documents no longer matched what Miles was actually planning. I looked through the windshield and understood that the affair had changed my marriage. But it was not the final problem Miles had created. He had also built a financial plan around 2 different versions of my future. Miles walked into the lender meeting, looking relaxed. Linda sat beside him. Erica took the chair near the window, and Dana sat next to me with a folder. Caleb Monroe, the lender handling the expansion, opened by saying the changes could not be treated as a simple personnel update. Miles said Erica was fully capable of stepping into my role. Caleb nodded and asked why the financing package submitted still listed me as a key operator for the next 18 months. Miles looked at me before answering. He said the documents had been prepared before our transition was finalized. As if that explained everything. Caleb turned to Dana, who placed the timeline showing that I had never approved any statement saying I would remain after being removed from operations. I said nothing because there was nothing I needed to add. The dates were clear enough. Caleb explained that the original proposal relied on Cedar Table's operating history, reporting controls, and management continuity. If I was leaving, the lender had to review the plan again rather than replace my name with Erica's and pretend nothing had changed. Miles insisted the restaurant had always been his family's business and would continue without me. Caleb calmly replied that nobody was questioning ownership, only whether the information supporting the financing was accurate. For the first time, Miles stopped looking confident. Then Dana opened the expense report. She asked Miles to explain the $26,000 that had moved from Cedar Table's operating reserve into travel, hotel, consulting, and development costs tied to the second location. Miles said those were legitimate expansion expenses and added that he had personally contributed money. Erica turned toward him so quickly that Linda noticed. She said Miles had told her the money used for the costs was his personal contribution. The room went still. Erica looked at Miles and asked him to say it again, because that was not what he had told her. Miles started explaining that the funds were temporary and would be replaced once financing closed. But Caleb stopped him and said the lender needed updated records and a full review. The expansion was not canceled, but it was no longer moving forward on the assumptions Miles had presented. I watched Erica pull her chair away from him, while Linda stared at her son like she was hearing his story for the first time. The meeting ended before lunch, but Linda did not let Miles leave. She told him to return to Cedar Table, and I went because Dana still needed records. The dining room was empty when Linda closed the doors behind us. She faced Miles across the bar and asked him to explain everything without changing the subject. For once, he had nowhere else to look. Linda started with the version he had given her. He said I wanted to step away. Erica was only helping with expansion, and the money for the new location was coming from him. Then she asked how much of that was true. Miles said I had made operations so complicated that nobody could move without my approval. I told him I had never stopped him from learning the systems, but he had never cared until he thought he could replace me. Erica arrived because Linda had called her back. She said Miles told her our marriage was already ending and that I was staying temporarily until the second location opened. I looked at Miles and asked when he planned to tell me that. He said nothing, and Erica finally understood that she and I had been living inside two different versions of the same plan. She did not apologize, and I did not ask her to. Linda turned toward Miles and asked why he had made my work sound small for years. He said every time people praised the systems I built, he felt like the restaurant was becoming mine instead of his family's. I told him the restaurant had never been mine, but the responsibilities he dismissed had always been real. Then I gave Linda notice that I would complete a reasonable transition, remove myself from responsibilities I could legally end, and correct records that still depended on me. I would not sabotage Cedar Table, but I would not keep carrying it from the shadows. The consequences started quickly. The expansion review slowed. Linda hired an operations consultant, and Miles had to explain the expenses tied to Erica. Erica withdrew from the second location because she no longer trusted what he said about the money or the marriage. Linda stood beside the empty host station and looked at her son. Then she said she had believed him because he kept saying I was not important. Now she understood why he needed her to believe it. Over the next few weeks, Miles and I began the separation process. There was no dramatic courtroom fight, and I never tried to take Cedar Table from his family. We divided the marital assets according to what actually belonged to each of us, and I kept only what I was legally entitled to keep. Linda remained the owner of the restaurant, and I completed the transition I had promised. For the first time in years, I was walking away without trying to make everything easier for everyone else. The second location stayed on hold while Linda worked with a new operations consultant. One afternoon, she asked to meet me alone after Cedar Table closed. She admitted she had spent years thinking I was supporting Miles rather than helping run the business beside him. I told her the hardest part was not that she underestimated me, but that she accepted his version of me without ever asking whether it was true. Linda lowered her eyes and said she understood that now. A few days later, Miles and I met to finish the last paperwork connected to our separation. He asked whether I was happy the expansion had stalled. I told him no, because people who had done nothing wrong had worked hard on that location too. But I was not going to keep a plan alive by pretending I would still carry responsibilities after being pushed out. Miles looked down at the papers between us and stayed quiet for a long time. Then he finally told me what had been happening inside him for years. Every time someone praised the systems I built or called me the person who kept Cedar Table running, he felt smaller. So he started telling people I only handled paperwork. And eventually, he started believing it himself. He said making my work sound ordinary had made him feel more important. I looked at him and realized he had never truly thought I was useless. He had known enough to depend on me. What he could not tolerate was admitting how much he depended on someone he wanted to feel stronger than. I told him that was the part of our marriage I could not repair for him. Miles nodded, and for once he did not argue. The marriage ended without either of us pretending the divorce itself was a victory. 6 months later, I was working as operations director for a hospitality group where nobody introduced me as someone's wife or the person who helped in the background. My name sat beside my title, and that felt different. I was still doing the work I had always done, but I no longer had to make myself smaller so someone else could feel larger. Only then, I understood how exhausting that had been. Miles stayed at Cedar Table and went back to focusing on the kitchen, where he had always been strongest. Linda kept the restaurant running with the new operations consultant, and the second location remained delayed while they rebuilt the plan. Erica did not stay with Miles or return to the expansion. She walked away after realizing how many versions of the same future he had told each of us. Linda and I never became close, and that was healthier than pretending everything had been repaired. We could speak respectfully, and she stopped treating my contribution as something that mattered only because I had married her son. Dana finished helping close out my responsibilities, and Caleb completed the lender review without turning it personal. Everyone ended up carrying the result of the choices they had made. What stayed with me most was not the affair or the delayed expansion. It was how long I had believed humility meant I should never need anyone to acknowledge what I contributed. I had spent 8 years thinking that loving a family meant quietly holding things together, even when they stopped seeing the person doing it. I know now that being modest is not the same as allowing yourself to disappear. If someone only feels strong when you make yourself smaller, that is not peace worth protecting. If this story reminded you of a time you were underestimated, tell me in the comments. Share it with someone who needs that reminder. And subscribe for more stories about boundaries, dignity, and rebuilding after betrayal. I lost a marriage, but I stopped losing myself.